these are active stations around the world. And you can go to any of these buoys online and hit the buoy and get the data from it. So I do it all the time for the buoy by my house to check the actual wind speed when I'm gonna go across the Puget Sound. So you can look at that.
What do they report it?
You can do it, or you can do it on the web, and you can get the data.
What data are they reporting?
It depends on the station. So there are some that are weather, there's some that are just wind speed and temperature, there's some that are tides, there's some that are deep water. Some of the ones in the Gulf of Mexico have arrays that go down on the legs of a oil platform, so you can get ocean currents and things beneath the sea. So this is just the same data set, but zooming in, you can see some of the stations around here. And we're up on this top yellow one, just by the border. That's the data buoys, it's the data that's coming off of the oil dock at Cherry Point. So you can look at that real time, like you could look at it right now and find out what the wind speed is if you wanted to right now, or the water temperature. And that's what this looks like zoomed in. Each of those is a sensor. There's water levels, there's meteorological, meaning weather data, other things. So this is real time, and this is one of the products that a pilot would use. If they bring a ship into the dock, they don't want the weather forecast. They want to know which way is the wind blowing right now. Another neighbor of yours that's NOAA is the National Estuarine Reserve System. Padilla Bay is a cooperative group between NOAA and, in this case, the Department of Ecology run Padilla Bay Reserve. But there's a National Reserve System, and each one has a little bit different structure, but NOAA typically provides about 2/3 of the funding, and then the state office actually administers it and owns the land and that kind of stuff. So most of the waters right here are part of the reserve, at least the south side of Sandwich Island. Okay, so let's go to some other things. NOAA runs a lot of ships. This is the NOAA ship Fairweather. And as of yesterday, she was just off the south coast of Lopez and heading into Bellingham to pick up some crew and heading to Ketchikan. This ship is a charting ship, and it's going to do charting in Alaska all summer. So looking at improving the nautical charts. We have a whole uniformed service that run the ships. So we have civilians, but there's about 400 officers that have the same rank as Coast Guard or Navy. But they're not an armed service. But they're scientific service, but they're like the public health service. We've got a lot of aircraft operations. Most of the aircraft are doing things like marine mammal surveys or hurricane hunters. You've probably seen the planes that fly into the eye of the hurricane. This one is doing snow surveys up in Alaska, and they do snow surveys to get an idea of how much water melt there's going to be to help with the hydrologic river forecast. Salmon and other fisheries, a big part of NOAA. So National Marine Fisheries Service is one of the bigger parts of the agency, and this part of the country is a big deal. The Fisheries Service offices here in the Seattle area also do a lot of work in Alaska and the whole Pacific coast. And they also do things like marine mammals. Southern resident killer whales is a big focus of the National Marine Fisheries Service. There's a whole group in Seattle that are in charge of the recovery planning for these animals. Bathymetry charting. So this is Elliott Bay and the central Puget Sound, but there's data like this for most of Puget Sound and a lot of the coastal areas of the United States. So downtown Seattle and Bainbridge Island. This is really detailed. If you were to zoom into this, you can find individual crab pots that were lost. So it's very, you can find the survey data, the raw data, and I use this data to figure out where to put my shrimp ponds. Because you can get those little drop-offs and platforms and places where, I didn't do so well last year. So, this is one of the bridges over the Columbia River, and one of the things that NOAA, as part of its charting mission, is not only water depth, but what they call air gap. So, a lot of the ships today are so large that they're gonna clear bridges with maybe a few feet, and that bridge may also sag with the temperature of the steel and the weather and the traffic on it. So they have some key bridges around the country, there are real-time sensors, and you can get real data on what's the air gap. Really important for places like New York Harbor, where there are lots of bridges, and the harbor infrastructure was built before the massive ships were built. So some of the next generation container ships are now 20,000 containers, huge vessels. I mentioned the estuarine reserve system. There's also a marine sanctuary system that is about to get much larger. And in fact, in the last month or two, there was an announcement of a much bigger preserve in the Pacific. There's a large additional expansion of the preserve system into the Great Lakes as well. So this is the equivalent of sort of the national parks in the sea, except that this system is significantly larger in terms of square miles. It's, you look at some of the systems out in the Pacific, all those atolls off the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, is a huge area that's under protection. A lot of coral reef habitats and critical areas.
And when you say under protection?
It depends on what the, some of the, well, the Olympic Coast, for example, still allows commercial fishing, recreational fishing, but doesn't allow offshore oil development. And there's areas, there's some navigation restrictions for certain kinds of vessels that have to go outside the boundaries. So it depends on how the sanctuary was designed. Some of them are very specific, and the one that, I don't know if you can read it, the one that says monitor, was the original marine sanctuary, and it was originally just a square mile, I think, and it was just to protect the wreck of the USS Monitor, the Civil War ironclad. And so that was designed to protect the wreck from people pillaging the wreck. But over the years, the system has grown, and some of the systems are quite large, and some of them are very specific about what they're protecting, like the humpback whales and the Hawaii, for example, are protected there.
Are the 200-meter restrictions around some of the Peapod rocks and I think Bird Rock, is that
No.
this system?
No, those are Fish and Wildlife Service, different agency, protection of seabirds, I think, for the most part. And then there's other restrictions like, approaching killer whales and stuff. Those aren't part of a reserve system, but they're part of a larger management.
Doug?
Yep. Oh.
Do you have a police force to monitor that?
There is the National Fisheries Service has uniformed officers that could board your vessel and investigate. If you see somebody violate the killer whale standoff distance, which I think is 200 yards, but going up to 300 yards now. If you see somebody, you can report that, and they might investigate if you have enough data on the vessel and what happened. They can certainly, they're more focused on investigating things like commercial fishing violations of vessels fishing in enclosed areas, but they have the authority to board a vessel and do other things. NOAA does a lot of research. A lot of it's the sort of next generation stuff is these autonomous vehicles like drones. There's something called a sail drone. It doesn't look like a sailboat, but that orange thing is actually got a sail, a plastic wing, and we can set those out and do monitoring during hurricanes, or they can do long-term deployments across the Bering Sea. Some of the ones, the gliders that they work on they basically go to the surface and then glide to the bottom and then reballast, float up and then glide to the bottom. They've gone all the way across the Atlantic doing that, and taking samples and taking measurements, all autonomously. So lots of different technologies. There's an office in Seattle called Pacific Marine Environmental Lab that designs and builds some of these things, and they also do the tsunami sensors and things like that. I mentioned tsunamis, so this is the example of a tsunami forecast. The tsunami warning system is part of NOAA, and we have this array of buoys. They can detect very small changes in the wave patterns and detect whether there's at sea, a tsunami can only maybe be a few inches high. Against the coast, it can be, dozens of meters high, but it can detect those anomalous wave patterns along with the forecast of where that earthquake was and predict where that tsunami wave's gonna go and how long it's gonna take to get there. Big part of NOAA's budget is satellites. So these are lots of research satellites, but also the weather satellites. When you see the news at night and you get the weather forecast and you see that satellite image of the weather fronts moving, those are coming from a NOAA satellite. NOAA manages them, but they're also in cooperation with NASA on the launch of those. And a big part of that is also the SARSAT system. So if you're a boater and you have an EPIRB on your boat, that's a little emergency locator device, or if a plane crashes and it sends out the automatic signal, that goes to a NOAA satellite that then goes to into an international system to the local Coast Guard to tell them where to look for the person. So that's okay, so getting closer. So this is, Weather Service does a lot of forecasting products. This is the actual temperature outlook for this coming week, in case you want to plan anything. So we do a lot of the short-term forecast, like what's going to happen tomorrow, this week, but then there's intermediate products, 6 to 10 days, maybe the next couple of months. So if you're a farmer or you're trying to manage a reservoir for water, you can look at our products and look at what's the probability. We do it for temperature and also for precipitation. So you can look at how to manage whatever you're trying to optimize. So weather, obviously big satellites, and hurricanes is a big deal. Okay, so getting even closer to the question about tides and currents. So NOAA is the nation's predictor for tides and currents. We've been doing this for since Thomas Jefferson days. This is an example of what happens when you don't really pay attention to tides and currents. This is a ship that ran aground off the port of Baltimore. The pilot took a momentary cell phone call, and minutes later was aground, and they were aground for about a month. Wow. So, they ended up having to unload the ship, some of the containers. So that's what they're doing, is they're picking containers off, one at a time to get the ship light enough so that they can pull the ship off. It was also aground on some oyster beds and things like that, so there were some habitats that they were trying to protect. And this gets into what my role in NOAA is, which is more on the emergency response side of oil spills, chemical spills. And my office was consulted on this because some of those containers have hazardous materials, and how do we handle them? What happens if we drop one when we're picking it up? It's not a usual thing to unload a container onto a barge in the middle of Chesapeake Bay. And emergency response. So this is, you guys recognize this? Yeah. Right. So we got called about this. This is the train derailment that happened about 2 weeks ago now, just on the other side of the bay here. So that was an interesting call. Luckily, the train rolled towards the shore instead of towards the bay. Luckily, none of the cars it was carrying went into the water or into the because it did have oil cars on the train. Because of the jurisdiction, most of this was dealt with by the state and EPA, and my office was notified. We provided a little bit of data on currents and things in the channel, but it was mostly not an ocean issue, it's more of a land cleanup issue. Climate research, I mentioned before, is a big part of NOAA. This is that famous trend of CO2, Mauna Loa in Hawaii. CO2 is driving climate change, which is driving water level changes in some places. But it's not, the data is not just from this one spot. There are other stations around the world, including Antarctica, where there's long data sets, but the one in Hawaii, they show a lot, because that's the longest data set that we have. So let's talk about water levels. So, NOAA is, on a national level, is looking at this issue of what they call high tide flooding or nuisance flooding. And it's not just here, it's any low-lying coastal communities. There are some very large cities like Miami, and places like the Florida Keys that are equally or more vulnerable than you guys are here. So there's a lot of concern about what does this mean and how can we deal with this, not just community by community, but at a national scale. So increasing frequency for a lot of reasons, and one of those is climate change. But we'll talk about the spring tide was a predicted event. The high tide event here was going to be a very high tide for the year. I think it was in my area, it was going to be 13.5 feet predicted down in the Seattle area. I think you guys have a little bit lower range up here, but it was going to be one of the highest tides in a couple of years. And then it was compounded by a weather front and other things. But these are predicted events based on the moon and the sun and a bunch of other data that go into predicting those tide ranges. There's high tide series every month, but then there's a longer series on almost a decadal scale. And if you go back and look at the data, we're in a period where we're going to have slightly higher tides than they're all predicted, but higher tides than they would have been a few years ago, just from the geometry of the planets and things. So there is a scale to it, but for the most part, they're predicted. What's not predicted well in advance is the weather patterns. So this is the data for downtown Seattle. And the blue line was the predicted high tide, and the green line was the observed high tide. So you see that high tide event in late December put us into that minor flooding range. And this scale is feet above the predicted, feet above the usual high tide. So if the usual high tide is, in Seattle, the usual high tide is around 11 to 12 feet, you could get a tide that could be significantly higher than that. So height above mean higher high water is the axis. So it's not above sea level, it's height above the mean higher high water. Every tide station that we have, you can go find it online and you can get data on what are the observed highest tides for that station. So this is, again, that downtown Seattle tide station closest to me. And you can see that it was 3.7 feet above mean higher high water.
Wow.
It actually, at one point, topped out the gauge. The gauge stopped working because at the top of the high tide time. So that was December 22. But if you look back, there's some other ones. I remember the one that was December 17, 2012, because my beach was flooded by that. So these are not, these are the observed peak waters for this station going back about 30 years. So every once in a while, you get an extreme tide at all these stations. If you look at the event, they're mostly because it's already above normal tide, and you have a storm event or a front passage. In some places, you get a combination of winds and weather. So if you have wind that's driving water into a basin, that can raise the water levels as well. And you can get this data for every tide station. I can show you that, what it is for your local ones. So the key to remember is that the tide gauge is only measuring the still water level. It doesn't include the wave height. So if you have a place that's exposed to wave energy, you're going to get, the light blue is the average high tide, the storm surge is the additional foot or two from that low pressure. But then if it's also rough bound, you can get waves that will carry up and cause, often that's what's causing the damage. It may be pumping water into the parking lot here. So the water level may not have been above the parking lot, but the waves might have been pumping water up here onto the beach. I don't know if that's what happened, but that's going to be easily how that would be perceived. So if you went back with the tide data would show what the tide gauge is protected, so it's not bouncing around. It's the high.
So is it the waves then that would have caused the current that was coming across that I was showing you earlier? It's the wave action that's causing the current to run fast.
I think so. I think you could have waves that would, push that water and get that flow going. But so the wind and the waves together.
We were really fortunate during that event that we didn't have a north wind.
That's what I was thinking. I didn't think it was a north wind.
Like the previous year.
Yeah, so the wind direction makes a big deal, and that's partly because it's going to push that water. And depending where you live, if you lived on the end of a long inlet, the water could really get pushed up there. So this is my beach. Normally, this is about 3 feet above high water. And so I've seen it like this once before in my life, and I've lived here for 60 years. So there's another thing going on with water levels, in that there's also a background sea level rise issue. And there's sea level rise that is in some places mitigated by the fact that the land is also rising, and in some cases it's exacerbated because the land is subsiding. So the direction of the arrows show which way sea level is going in a location. And you can see right in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico off the New Orleans, the red big arrow. They've got a combination of sea level rise, but they also have a lot of land subsidence. So they're in the worst case scenario. But if you look on the west coast, there are places in the Gulf of Alaska and off north end of Vancouver Island where the land is rising, so the relative sea level is actually dropping. So it depends on where you are, and that's why they say when there's a sea level, it's localized. And I'll zoom into our area here. So these are, you can see there are some places where sea level is rising, but if you go out to the tip of Nia Bay or out on Vancouver Island, there's places where sea level is declining. And I think that probably correlates pretty well with where the fault lines are, and over time, the land on that side of the fault is kind of rising. There's also a thing called glacial rebound, where some of the northern areas are still rebounding from the last ice age 10,000 years ago. So in places really far north, the land can be still recovering from the loss of that miles thick ice that was sitting on. So this is one station. This is the downtown station in downtown Seattle, and it's showing it's one of the oldest stations around here. It's 1900 to the present. There's a station at Cherry Point that's been there since I think the 1950s, I think. It shows a similar trend of rising sea level, but not as dramatic as the one in Seattle, and partly that's because the data series is not as long. You can see there's a lot of variability in seasonal cycles. What this is saying is since 1899 to 2022, there's been about a half a foot or so, 0.6 foot of sea level rise at this one station. On an annual basis, that's about 2 millimeters, which is about the thickness of a nickel. So that's not much on an annual basis, but if you have 100 years of data, it starts to add up. So you have a baseline that's also, you add the storm surge and you add the high tide, you know, it's, over time, things are gonna continue to get worse. In some places faster than others. If you live in New Orleans, it's gonna happen faster than it's gonna be on some other sites. So this is now data for the Cherry Point site in the same event, and I think Amy said you guys shared this this kind of graphic. But this shows again that that flooding event on the late December and how extreme it was relative to that mean high water. So it puts you well above the minor flooding into probably more significant flooding. So some resources, there's a lot of work being done on climate change and sea level, and UW has some event activities. There's a program at the University of Washington that is looking at this issue. They've got a lot of data and simulations you can look at. I think they even have a map of Sandwich Island that you can look at under different scenarios, what would be the shoreline. There's planning, and this could even be Sandwich Island. I don't know if that's a picture of extreme flooding. But there are places like that over on the peninsula side. I know over by Squim and Dungeness Spit, they have some very low-lying coastal roads that get flooded at high tides as well. And there are also some grant opportunities for folks if they're trying to do resilience. Pavia mentioned the fire station here, trying to get some funding to put in a more sustainable, maybe off the grid fire station if they lose power. So there are maybe other small grants that are available to communities. And I mentioned this is the Cherry Point site. This is today. This is the prediction yesterday, I think. And what I wanted to show you is if you go to this site and you go to the more data, you can look at all these other things, which include sea level trends and tide predictions and other water levels. So there's a lot of data if you want to look at what the trends are for your area and what are those top 10 worst high tides events. And that's that. I think I'm gonna stop there. I used enough time. I was gonna talk about what I do, but I think I'd rather hear about what Shellfish folks are doing. So, you want to take over? Broad questions. The emergency response and oil spills and chemical spills is where I spend most of my time.
Mine gets that, what is NOAA's responsibility to the people on Sandwich Island?
So, to provide the best predictions we can, and to provide that information to publicly, but also to emergency planners. So I would say NOAA doesn't have the authority to, say, close a road, but we do have the ability to inform local, road managers, the county, the emergency response of what's going on. And we do have, on the high tide flooding events, there is a system where you can go on the NOAA tides nationally and see which tide stations are in an anomalous position. Are they recording a really high water level or a really low water level over a certain percentage over the prediction? So that goes out, that's available. As far as what is NOAA, maybe you could clarify or expand your question.
Well,
Yeah.
Sandwich Island is an island, it doesn't have a city, it's not got any one leadership. All the data that you have is provided to the county,
Yeah.
we may never see it. But we're the ones impacted.
Right.
Who's got some responsibility to get that data to the user, the needed user? I mean,
Yeah.
and that.
Well, some of the data's
may be
out
more
there,
of a political
but,
question
yeah,
than anything.
some of the data is already out there, but you have to know where to look for it. And then some of the data needs to be understood by developing models and other predictive tools based on that. So if you wanted to know under what scenarios would our road be flooded and how frequently under different tidal elevation scenarios, that's a modeling question that might require, working with either the county or maybe the local university. NOAA would provide the raw data, and in some places, we might even provide the coastal expertise through our Sea Grant outreach experts. The Sea Grant program is also part of NOAA, so there's a bunch of ways we could improve our outreach to any community through those networks.
Thank you.
One thing, and I only really saw one reference to it, and you're not a climatologist, I'm not expecting you to answer, but I think for us, a critical thing is the frequency or the intensity of these extratropical cyclones, and I don't know if you're gonna hit on that at all. That bring these low pressure systems to us, a lot of them. The lowest ever, 1962 Columbus Day storm, that was extratropical cyclone. That was the lowest barometric pressure recorded, I think, in western Washington. You had a chart up there that showed some of the high tide events in Seattle.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that of those, only I think 3 on that chart, and not including the December 27th, were extratropical cyclones. So other things can bring those low pressures, but I think that's one thing we kind of need to be aware of going forward is as I understand it, the intensity of these things might be going up due to
Right,
climate
I think
change.
that's part of the concern and that's partly the nomenclature of saying climate change, is that things are getting more variable. You look at what happened in California this year, the snowpack this year. Incredibly dynamic, and so it's tough to predict those things, but there is some understanding that maybe they'll happen more frequently, and they could also be combined with things like more rain and less snowfall that could also drive river systems that also have a localized water level effect. So if you think about a rainstorm in the middle of December, that would have normally been a snowfall event, and for most of the region turning to a rain event, there's a lot of that water that's immediately going into that.
The general zeitgeist on the West Coast is that we don't have a lot of reporting stations out, so that are as many, and of course across the country, the accuracy of the weather predicting may be better the further inland you are.
Yeah.
Is that really true? Meaning, how far out do our predictions go these days to be able to prepare for a big?
I think
wind
that
event or anything?
it's probably still true, but not as true as it was. There are better radar systems now on the Washington coast that are looking out, but it's a lot easier to predict the weather in Wyoming if you know what's happening in California. So there's a lot of observations upwind of you essentially, because the prevailing weather patterns are going across. But there's a lot of observation systems, so there's a lot of data out there, but that buoy system array, if you look at those buoy arrays, there's a lot of them out here, but they're not nearly as many as they are in the Gulf of Mexico.
Hmm.
And there are very few if you go up into the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea, where we might have a couple dozen instruments that we could look at in this general Salish Sea area. And if you're up in the Bering Sea, you might have 2 or 3, and they might be seasonal because they get taken out by ice. So depending on where you are, it can be thin. And in my area of pollution response, we worry about some of those remote areas where there isn't good data, because we're using that same data to drive our computer models that are predicting how chemicals are gonna move and oil's gonna move and things like that. And the data can be pretty sparse in some areas.
Right. Stock shellfish. So Amy gave me a few different topics to try to hit on today. You can see in the title there, and so it's kind of a broad range of stuff, but I thought I'd start out with just a few slides to remind you what all goes on out here for shellfish farming. So to start off with, I'm Bill Dewey, Director of Public Affairs for Taylor Shellfish Farms. And I have my own farm in the bay as well, Chuckanut Shellfish. The Taylors, just by way of background, you know, if people are familiar with their facility over on Chuckanut, they've got a couple thousand acres in the bay here where they grow clams, oysters, and buoy duck. We have about 14,000 acres total on all of our different farms throughout the Sound, the canal, out on the coast. We also have farms up in British Columbia, and it's a vertically integrated company. We have hatcheries that produce the seed, nurseries reared up to go out to the farms processing, even have our own restaurants as well. So big family business, family-owned business. They've been at it since 1890. I've worked for them for the past 30 years in the position I've got now. So they're good people, dedicated to sustainable farming and water quality and all the things that we keep going for many more generations is their hope. So let's launch in here. So these are the different products that are grown in Sandwich Bay. You got the Manila clams on the left, the oysters in the middle, and the gooey duck is kind of a newer product to the bay here. We started farming gooey duck in the 1990s. So a good wild harvest fishery for gooey duck in Puget Sound that takes about 4 million pounds a year. And then the industry, Taylors included, started experimenting with farming in the 90s, figured it out by the 2000s, and collectively, between Taylors and the other companies now, we're doing about 2 million pounds a year, so about half the wild production that we're producing on our farms. So this is a map of tideland ownership in Sandwich Bay. So unique in Washington is we can actually own our tidelands. Any other state in the country, if you're gonna have a shellfish farm, you lease those lands from the state. Washington, shortly after we became a state, opted to sell tidelands into private ownership to try to stimulate an industry to farm native oyster and bring the resources back that were being overharvested and depleted. So it worked really well. The industry bought tidelands and early on farmed that native oyster and later transitioned to Pacific oysters and other different species as well that we grow on the farms there. So these, all these tideland parcels, I always like to show this because you see all the terrestrial farms that we all know so well, but then when you cross the dike and go out in the bay, these are all parcels that are owned by Taylors, by Blough's, Penn Cove now leasing a lot of Blough's land, Sandwich Gold, different people out there that have tideland ownership. And that's where my farm's at. I own 32 acres there out in the middle of the bay. And this is a picture of my farm at low tide, a drone shot, and kind of to give you an idea of just how flat the bay is out there and how big a deal it makes when the tides are off. You're seeing in his slides there, a foot difference means the difference of going out or not on the farm. If we get a low pressure front coming in, my farm won't go dry. So this is what it looks like. At low tide, normally it's under about 8 or 10 feet of water. These are rows of Manila clams that are growing under part of their exclusion nets to keep the ducks and the crabs from eating the clams. And it's in sand, so we're able to mechanically harvest them with my boat that I just launched this morning. Quite an ordeal in the wind this morning, I might add.
I should have brought you coffee.
Yeah. Pretty welcomed it. It was a rough morning. And then we harvested, this is a tulip bulb harvester we modified from the Rusin family there to bigger clams. And we have implements that we've adapted from terrestrial farming to install those nets on the farm. And mechanized. I've kind of pioneered this on my farm, and then it's been adopted by tailors in Bend Cove and others out in the bay. This is a manila clam seed from Taylor's hatchery that we plant on the farm, and what the finished product looks like 3 years later. And then I started farming gooey duck on my farm as well. I started in 2017, transitioning to a certain portion of my farm, the northern part of my farm, over to gooey duck. So we started out in these plastic mesh nursery tubes that we install in the beach and plant three of those baby gooey duck seed in each of those tubes. And then the tubes are on for about 2 years until the baby gooey ducks get deep enough that the young predators are able to eat them and drying out at low tide. You can see the young gooey duck seed are just like the adult, they can't get all the meat inside the shell, so they're really vulnerable to predators eating them and drying out at low tide. So. And then it goes about another 4 years, 6 years total to get to that size that Julie is.
6
holding
years?
here. She's come out and helped us a lot, both installing tubes and on the harvest events as well. And Dorothy, another champion that comes out and helps us on the farm as well. You'll see a flea on the island email list when I'm seeding and so on. This is what I'm looking for help with. And then we unintentionally grow a lot of macroalgae as well. So a lot of stuff, a lot of this ovate intestinalis grows on our tubes and our gooey duck crops. You can see all the gooey duck siphons sticking up through the seaweed there. And so we're part of a grant to try to find efficient way to harvest the seaweed and then something useful to do with it. So some of you were, I delivered some totes of seaweed around the island last summer that we harvested, but this is an explanation of that grant. And we've got basically a big pool vacuum that we've developed to suck that stuff off the farm and dewater it and put it into these totes and try to find something good to do with it. We're not there yet. So this is the traditional Sam's Bay bottom cultured oysters, clusters for shuck meat production. It's the history of the bay out here for sure. It's transitioning, not a lot of clusters for shucking anymore. It's kind of going by the wayside. That's a hard market to make money in. It's not really very profitable. There's a lot of labor in it and not a lot of profit. So it's an area that's kind of dying in the industry, which I think is unfortunate. I don't like to have to shuck them. I like to just buy a jar and pan fry them. And then this is another method. If the ground's too muddy, we grow them suspended on lines up above the mud there. And those are clusters that also get shucked. This is our processing plant down in Shelton. These guys get pretty adept at it. They get paid by the pound that they open a meat, so people get pretty skilled.
Wow, look at him go.
And those meats are washed and graded for size, packed into various containers. More of the industry's transition, yeah.
I'll apologize for asking the question. Do they make a sustainable wage?
Yes. Yeah, the wages are good, you know, we're all challenged right now finding labor, so that the wages have been creeping for everybody, but yeah, I know that, you know, it's, for the rural areas we live, it's a wage that people can live on and buy cars on, groceries, and rent houses or buy houses. Yeah, we have, for our company, we have 401k, we have vacation benefits, we have medical benefits and stuff for employees. So the industry is transitioning, tailors in particular, to single oysters. It's more profitable. The oyster bars, the barbecue, where you're selling single oysters instead of clusters. It's a whole different process for growing them. This is something we do quite a bit out in the bay here with these bags that flip with the tide. So you put the single oyster seed in the bag and the buoy flips up and down with the tide and the oysters tumble. It changes the shape of the oyster. It gives them a deep cup and a smooth shell, which makes them premium for the national market. So shifting gears, that's a little background on what we're doing out in the bay. I think I've talked on that before, so I didn't want to spend a whole bunch of time on that, but I want to talk a little bit about how climate change is impacting the industry. It's really more so it's a different problem caused by the same pollutant, carbon dioxide, but about a third of our CO2 emissions are actually absorbed by the ocean. And when that happens, there's a chemical reaction that produces carbonic acid, and more significantly for us, is it reduces the carbonate ions in the seawater, and that's what our shellfish build their shells with, is those carbonate ions. So this is just a chart showing from 1800 to 2100. You can see what's happened. The pH has dropped. We've increased the acidity of the ocean about 30, the surface waters of the ocean by about 30% already. And more importantly, the blue there is the carbonate ions, so we've decreased the availability of carbonate ions across the world's oceans, surface water, by 16%. By the end of the century, they predict that we will have increased the acidity by 100 to 150% and reduced the carbonate ion availability by 50%. The west coast of the United States is a naturally upwelling system, and so there's a lot of CO2 that's been absorbed from the Pacific Ocean and circulating at depth for years. And when we have upwelling events, they come to the surface. And so we're kind of tip of spear for ocean acidification effects. And we're seeing levels that are predicted for 2100 now, coming up off of Washington's coast and into Puget Sound. So we can see the effects on our shellfish and what's predicted for the end of the century throughout the world's oceans. So where it impacted us is about 15 years ago, our shellfish larvae and our hatchery were dying routinely. You know, typically, we built our hatchery in '89. We produced billions and billions and billions of oyster larvae. Every now and then there'd be a crash and everything in the hatchery would die. We didn't understand why. And then in about 2007, all of a sudden those crashes became the norm. And we were having a big problem producing seed. At the same time, good friends of ours with a major hatchery on the Oregon coast, their seed production collapsed as well. There's some areas where there's natural recruitment of Pacific oysters where people catch seed in the wild. The natural areas, the seed collection failed as well. So we had an oyster seed crisis on the west coast. None of the farms had oyster seed to plant on our farms. It took a while, it took a couple years of research with NOAA scientists, our industry scientists trying to sort this out, what was killing our oyster larvae. But NOAA has a leading scientist here at the PMEL lab, Dr. Richard Feely, who's a leading world expert on ocean acidification, and he came to us and said, here's what I think's going on. Sure enough, that's been proven out by research. But so this is a scanning electron microscope image of a day-old oyster larvae. And this is from our hatchery on the canal. We have two different intakes. We have a deep water intake and a shallow water intake. And so we can, with monitoring equipment now, we can tell where we get the best water for our larvae. But if there aren't enough carbonate ions in the water, so that oyster larvae, after the egg's fertilized, these are microscopic, it's got to do two things in the first 24 hours. It's got to build a shell to protect itself, and it's got to build what's called a velum, this little ciliated appendage that it swims and feeds with. While it's plankton free floating for 3 weeks in the water, it's microscopic and it's free swimming in the water. Well, it does that with natal energy that's stored in the egg. If there aren't enough carbonate ions in the water, it struggles to build the shell. The shell comes out small and deformed like you see on the right, instead of big and round like it's supposed to look like on the left. And then it runs out of energy before it's able to build that velum that it needs to swim and feed with. So then they die, they just land on the bottom of the tank. We would see the larvae dead on the bottom of the tank. We'd scoop them up, put them under our microscope, and all we could see is, yep, they're dead. So we got, with the help of a nonprofit group, got some funding to get time on the scanning electron microscope at Oregon State University and got these images. And it was kind of like, oh boy, this is not good, you know. And that stimulated the OSU scientists to actually do the research to tell us the story I just told you, so we understood what was going on there. You can see here how important that velum is at that stage of our life. Without it, they're toast.
But at this stage, they actually have something that constitutes kind of a shell, a calcium carbonate.
Yeah, from
Carbonate of some sort.
from fertilization, they're pulling calcium carbonate out of the water to build that shell to protect themselves. Yeah, within 24 hours, there's two recognizable shells. It looks like a baby clam like you saw there. But yeah, if everything's right, they got the carbonate ions to do it.
Feed them limestone.
What's that?
Feed them limestone.
Yeah. Well, that's what we do. So in the hatchery. So that's how we've adapted in the hatchery. We now have very sophisticated water chemistry monitoring equipment in the hatchery and water treatment systems that automatically boost the carbonate ions by injecting sodium carbonate into the water to bring the carbonate ion concentration back up so that our babies can build their shells again and we're back in the seed production business. But that was, you know, that's like a 3 or 4 year endeavor. In the meantime, we're struggling trying to figure out how to get seed. So fortunately, we have a hatchery in Hawaii as well that didn't experience that, so we were able to boost our production in the hatchery. Another company came to Hawaii and built a hatchery over there, that got a lot of international press when that happened as well. So we did things to try to adapt. So this was the reaction, of course, you know, we panic and then ultimately adaptation. So we ramped up the monitoring and the research. We started treating our hatchery water like I mentioned. We're looking at breeding ocean acidification, resistant oysters that can tolerate that changing water chemistry. We've expanded seed production in Hawaii, experimenting with seagrass and culturing seaweed as a second crop adjacent to your shellfish, because that sucks up the CO2 and can naturally improve the water. So it may be in the future, bays like Sandwich Bay or out on the coast, Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor, the coastal estuaries that are full of eelgrass. Those may be in the future the only place we're able to grow shellfish. It's naturally mitigating that water chemistry for us. So, you know, and we're looking to that down the road as conditions get worse. In the hatchery, we're only pumping in 400 gallons a minute. We can treat the water. But out on the farm, we can't possibly do that. So you gotta look for natural ways to make it work.
So I didn't know how dependent eelgrass, was for something like this, and one of the big discussions going on right now is the green crab
Right.
affecting eelgrass and everything, so is
That's-
this potentially gonna impact you?
Well, I mean, anything that impacts eelgrass can potentially impact us. And the green crab is one of them. You know, we're not getting tons of them yet out in Sandwich Bay. We're trapping away here trying to keep that from happening. But out on the coast, tens of thousands of them. They've got big numbers out in those coastal estuaries. And that's something that they're finally, I've been urging this for a long time. They're so focused on spending money to monitor and collect them and control them. They're not actually doing the research to understand if and what they're impacting. And I think that's really critical research to prioritize where they're doing the control work. You know, so if they're eating eelgrass like they've done in some areas, doesn't look like they are yet, but maybe they are, we're not looking. Same thing with the shellfish. We don't, the numbers here aren't big enough for us to see damage. On the coast, the numbers are now big enough, they need to start looking at that. We've got content analysis or, you know, different ways to try to figure out if there are actually how many shellfish. So this was, you know, we were the first industry in the world to be impacted by ocean acidification and NOAA. So it got a lot of media attention, and, you know, both here in the country and internationally as well. We had really good response from our elected officials. Governor Gregoire was governor at the time. She formed an ocean acidification blue ribbon panel. I served on that. Came up with 42 recommendations on what the state could do in response to ocean acidification. That was forwarded on to the legislature with a recommendation for a big budget to implement it. The legislature debated it and appropriated a good sum of that money and created the Ocean Acidification Center at the University of Washington, which continues to get funded by the legislature. So they've been doing a lot of great work to understand both how to help our industry, but also to understand how ocean acidification is helping all the other calcifiers and all the other, hurting all of the other organisms out of the sound that are important resources as well. Roughly a third of the organisms in Puget Sound are calcifiers that could conceivably be seeing a similar impact to shellfish. There's different types of calcium carbonate, and some dissolve more easily than others. Our oyster larvae use aragonite, which is particularly soluble, and that's why they were so severely impacted. But other shellfish use different forms of calcium carbonate that don't dissolve quite as easily. So that may be part of our future as well, as shifting species to harder species that can tolerate the changes.
Can you give an example?
Well, for one example would be the native oyster, the Olympia oyster. Of course, it's really tiny, you know, but that's what the industry originated on. But it's grown here. As I mentioned earlier, this is a natural upwelling area. So even pre-industrial era, we would see these upwelling events would cause conditions that would dissolve oyster larvae 11% of the time. Today, because of the added CO2, it's a third of the time the events are worse. But that Olympia oyster has lived in this upwelling dynamic environment, and it looks like from research it's more tolerant than the Pacific oyster, which we imported from Japan and didn't evolve with that dynamic changing carbon. So anyhow, I've told this story in a lot of places, and have been really fortunate to tell it in some places to policymakers that can actually make a difference. And spoken at different forums all around the world, including at the United Nations, which is kind of a cool opportunity. And 3 different times I've spoken to different audiences at the United Nations. This was actually in front of some world leaders, which was actually cool. I was invited and told I had 3 minutes. But I was the last speaker, and everyone else had used more and more time. I was either gonna get cut off, or I had my 30-second version in my pocket, and that's what I was given. Thank you, Bill. So this is a great website if you wanna learn more about ocean acidification. It's the main houses of the Blue Ribbon Panel report. We now have what's called the Marine Resources Advisory Council. Governor Inslee's now his Ocean Acidification Office essentially is MRAC. I serve on that as well. This is a great resource for that. Web page for Governor Inslee as well has been out on the beds with us. Climate change is also having an impact on mussels. So the University of Washington has a lab out in Friday Harbor, and Lake Carrington, and the students have done a lot of research there. And in a warmer, higher CO2 ocean, mussel byssal threads that they attach to the farms and on the pilings, with the byssal threads get weaker and the shells get thinner. So we already have a problem when we grow mussels on our rafts. When the mussels get up to market size, they get pretty heavy, and if the byssal threads aren't strong enough, they slough to the bottom, and we feed the crabs on the bottom. So sloughing is already an issue. If it gets worse, that's going to be a problem. And of course, sea level rise, and this, I can't remember what year I took this picture on the North Beach there, but you know, you get, we're fortunately on December 27th, we didn't have this kind of wind, or it would have been devastating. So, and then of course, when the yards get flooded, the septic systems go under, when that tide goes back out, you know, it's pulling all that back out into the bay. Not a good situation. So, one of the things the shellfish growers have done, led by a friend of mine in Maine, a shellfish grower in Maine, is the leader in the industry on the East Coast. He reached out to some of our the leading companies, East and West, and we formed the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. We now have over 270 members all around the country of shellfish growers. Some are restaurants as well that serve shellfish, but trying to use our stories about how climate change and ocean acidification is impacting us to educate the public, but also to educate policymakers so that hopefully they can, you know, deal with the carbon pollution issue. From all of the good work that was done by the Blue Ribbon Panel here and the original panel to Governor Gregoire, stemming from that came this International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. That Washington state plan has now become a model for other states all around the country and other countries all around the world. So it's really cool. Governor Gregoire said this early on when confronted about what can Washington state possibly do about ocean acidification. It's a worldwide problem. And she said, we can lead. And that's in fact what we've done. So let's shift to tides. So they're complicated. You heard a little bit about it. I've worked in it for 40 years. I still really can't explain it. I've tried to learn. This is a wonderful book to show you just how many different forces there are that make the tides so complicated and so different. Obviously, the gravitational pull of the sun and moon are the dominant ones, but the weather, as you've seen as well, is. This website is Parker McCree's an oceanographer at the University of Washington. It's done a lot to help me understand the tides, and in particular, enlightened me to the 18.6-year cycle, which I've shared on the island email list before to talk about. But that's a great website if you want to snap a picture and go to that website. There's all sorts of information about the tide journey and sea level rise as well. There's links to different resources, NOAA resources, and so on. They're complicated. So this is that 18.6-year cycle. So as I understand it, the lunar plane is off by 5 degrees from the Earth rotating around the sun. And so if you think of a plate wobbling on the counter, That's the moon wobble with that 5-degree difference. And it takes 18.6 years for that wobble to complete a cycle. And that changes that gravitational pull and affects the tide. So this is, the red is 2025, and the purple is 2017. So you can see we're approaching the point in that 18.6-year cycle where we've got the extreme low tides, but also higher highs. It affects it, I didn't realize this, I thought it would affect the highs just as much as it did the lows. But I was reading more carefully on Parker's website this morning, and it's actually the lows, you can see the red popping down more, and you can see the red popping up. It affects it more on the low side, which, when I started farming in the bay, you know, I had these big extreme tides, all this land I was farming, and all of a sudden, but gradually, those extreme tides were fewer and farther between, and I didn't have as many days as I could work on my farm. My farm is between a 0 and a -1, so my farm is really deep. And I need those big low tides to work on my farm, and they're going away, and that's what made me reach out to Parker and say, hey, what's going on here? And you help me understand this. So we're kind of at this point, and Steve's got a chart he can share with you in a bit here to explain why we need to be worried about the road access and more events like we had in December coming up.
So that was what, I thought we were at the top of that 18, but it looks like we have a few more years.
I think 2025 is the peak of it now. So this is observed tide height in Seattle, averaging the tides. The black line is pulled out down here, but it's averaging the tides, so it takes out the high and lows, high and lows, and high and lows. So you can see the seasonal variation from January to December. And so you see how in the winter months, these highs go extra high and not so much in the summertime. And it's related to the weather, and the two dominant factors related to the weather. And that's the barometric pressure, but also the fact that our storms in the wintertime are predominantly from the south-southeast, which combined with the Coriolis effect drives water into the coast and into the Strait of Juan and pushes our tides higher. And then when we have that coupled with low barometric pressure that comes with those storms, that allows the tide to come up. So in the summertime, when we have high atmospheric pressure, it'll push the low tides lower. So the actual versus predicted is opposite in the wintertime, but the red line goes below the blue line and the tides go lower into those high pressure scenarios, whereas in the wintertime, that red line, the actual comes above. So what Parker explains, these are Parker slides, is that mean sea level can be up to 2 feet higher in the winter than during the summer. And the two reasons are the weather that I just explained. So this is a great website or app I have on my Android phone. I think, Steve, do you have an iPhone?
No, it's an Android.
Android. So I don't know if it works on the iPhones or not, but this is a great app for seeing what the barometric pressure is predicted to do. So this is captured here this morning. So that's a 72-hour, 9th, 10th, and 11th of April. And also with that graph comes a forecast that tells you what's.
Can we back up for just a second? So they're talking about big winds tomorrow, the 9th, at 2 o'clock. You see we're going to down to 2988, I think it is, and then look at that line going up. That rate of change is, the absolute barometric pressure is important, but the rate of change really drives the winds. We're gonna get some wind tomorrow afternoon.
More of the south, I think. Later in the week, there's some north. But all of us working in the Bay have a whole suite of websites and apps that we use to try to sort out what's really gonna happen out there. Obviously, I guessed wrong this morning. A lot of practice there. So this is the same tides and currents site, and I look at this religiously when I'm gonna go out in the day. My farm is so vulnerable with just that 1 foot variation. So because of what's going on right now with the low barometer, you can see how the tide is off almost a foot right now. on the lower end, which is what I do work my farm. My son works for Taylor's and he's been complaining that, you know, they've only had a couple hours to work on the tide because it's just not going out. And so with that difference, I had my crew, a whole crew scheduled to come out tomorrow. We were gonna start harvesting clams and I canceled because my farm's not gonna go down after work. So then I'll finish up with a couple slides on the shoreline armoring, and now, I'm not the expert here, but obviously with this king tide, people are saying, what do we do, you know, and obviously the preference, if you can make it work, is soft armoring. People are always trying, you know, the restoration efforts around Puget Sound are trying to pull hard armoring out and encourage people to put in soft armoring, and hopefully have the same effect. I know some people have tried that here on Sandwich Island and had mixed results with it. So I'm not necessarily advocating it, but I'm on the Puget Sound Partnership Ecosystem Coordination Board, so I'm part of the overall effort to restore Puget Sound. And this was a presentation we had on the Shore Friendly program, which per this says they've reached more than 1,400 landowners, resulting in armor removal and healthier shorelines. And this is the Shore Friendly website, and they have grants available and so on if people want to invest in soft armoring on their beach. There's grant help to do that. I think that's
Bill? Bill,
Yeah.
could you, just for us rookies, what is the amount of days or hours that you have for, from planting or clams, mussels, and oysters? How long does it take
to get to a market size.
to get to market size?
It varies with the tide height that you're planting them on the beach. The deeper you plant, the faster they grow, which makes sense. They're underwater more. They're only growing when they're underwater and feeding. So lower on your beach is faster. So for example, my farm, Manila clams, I'm at a market size in 2 years, but I gained enough weight in that third year that it's worth it for me to leave the crop in for a third year to bump my yield up that much more. But Taylor's have a lot higher ground, and so some of their ground, they're gonna go 3, 4, even 5 years on the really high ground. So it makes a difference, even though we're all in the same bay, same substrate, tidal elevation can make quite a difference.
And how about the mussels and?
So mussels are one of the faster growing. You know, mussels are typically, at least on our rafts, they're underwater all the time. You know, that's a year and a half crop for us. 18 months for mussels, typically to market size. Geoduck 6 years. Oysters, it depends on what you're trying to do. You know, if you're eating them raw and you just want a small oyster, year and a half. If you're looking for something for the barbecue, maybe 4 inches, you're maybe talking 2 years to 3 years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you address marine toxins, what we call red tides,
Red tide,
not
sure.
knowing better, and the frequency and how you deal with that?
Yeah, great question. So red tide is caused by a marine phytoplankton, that dinoflagellate that oysters and clams feed on, and it has a bunch of neurotoxins associated with it that don't affect the shellfish, but it will affect humans. They'll concentrate those toxins, and then when we eat the shellfish, because they're neurotoxins, they affect your autonomous nervous system, so they're really dangerous. You'll forget how to breathe, your heart forgets how to beat. You have to have somebody do CPR if you get a serious batch of it. So that's why as soon as we're sampling our beaches every couple weeks. Someone from Penn Cove or Taylor's is typically taking turns sending samples in from Sandwich Bay. Then the state has what they call mussel sentinels, because mussels are the first to pick it up and first to drop it. So the state maintains mussel sentinels. They have one on Sandwich Island. They have them all around Puget Sound, where they're either working with volunteers or they're collecting those mussel sentinels and testing them. So we're trying to keep a really close eye on what's going on. Because they can't sample recreational beaches at the frequency they need to protect public health, as soon as they start to see it, they'll close recreational beaches, even though it hasn't exceeded the criteria of the level, 80 micrograms of toxin is the cutoff level. And then as soon as we'll see it in the bay, then we start testing more frequently. And then, you know, when you start getting close to the 80 micrograms, then they'll go lot by lot. You know, if you want to keep harvesting, they'll say, if you get that shellfish out of the water, send a sample to the lab, make sure it clears before you can sell that that shellfish. For Taylor's, because we have so many different farms in different areas, we just get out, you know, as soon as we start to see red tide, we just get out of that area and work other farms rather than take a chance.
There's a broader, term called harmful algal blooms, HABs, and there's a whole bunch of research going on, academic, and we have some forecast tools, and it's not just marine waters, it's also like in the Great Lakes, there's concerns, and it's not just shellfish, because depending on where you are, it can also affect, Dungeness crab on the west coast the harvest has been delayed or changed because of HAB outbreaks. And it's also been associated with some of the mortality events for marine mammals as well.
Yeah, there's different types. Red tide's the most common one we hear about here in the Puget Sound, but on the coast it's domoic acid, which causes what they call amnesic shellfish poison, causes you to lose your memory. Sometimes it's short term, sometimes it's long term. But that's what closes down the radar. I think I've eaten too many of them. But it shuts down the razor clam fishery on the coast, and Dungeness crab will eat razor clams, and then they'll get the toxin in them because of it. They're not filter feeders, but they'll get the toxin from eating razor clams. They don't get it in the muscle meat. The muscle meat's safe, but there's a lot of people that eat the gut,
Eat the butter.
the fat of pancreas and stuff from the Dungeness, and that concentrates it. So that's, they'll either make them eviscerate the crab, they'll shut the commercial fishery down and make them process them all and stuff like that. You know, we've had challenges with the sewage system or septic systems in Edison, Blanchard, and major projects to get all of that fixed. And we got an upgrade in a portion of the bay because of that. And then in 2011, we had a 2011 was a downgrade where the state downgraded 4,000 acres in Sandwich Bay from approved to conditionally approved, which now means whenever we have a certain amount of rain, the river rises a certain amount. It's complicated, but there's a loading calculation of bacteria in the bay that they do that determines whether we stay closed until we get clean samples or they open us right back up. But as soon as we cross flow thresholds at the Thomas Road Bridge, or at the 99 bridge, they pull a sample at Thomas Road and do a loading calculation. And long story short, Clean Sandwich Initiative, tremendous response. We've been working on this for a lot of years, too many in my opinion, but you know, people in the watershed have been great. People have stepped up, fixing failed septic systems, fencing animals out of the creeks, picking up after their pets. You know, it's been a collective effort. And continually, the loading has gone down in the Sandwich River. And so the number of days that were closed because of pollution coming out the river has diminished dramatically to where in 2011, it was probably an average of around 65 days a year that we were shut down. And now it's down to a dozen or 15 days a year. So it's getting better. We haven't quite crossed the threshold where they're going to upgrade the bay yet, but it continues to improve. Yeah. And it's because of all the hard work of everybody in the watershed. Yeah.
How long you been in business? Did you say 30 years?
30 for Taylor. So I started in 81 working for Rockport.
So you were not involved when they put secondary treatment in at Georgia Pacific? Which
No.
I think was was about then.
In Georgia Pacific in Bellingham?
Yeah. Before they put secondary treatment in up at Georgia Pacific, you couldn't grow an oyster and get it to marketable size before it died.
Yeah, those were the early battles. And generation before me fought the pulp mills, both here in Bellingham and South Sound, devastated our industry. There were decades of lawsuits, the shellfish industry against the pulp and paper industry.
Spent sulfite liquor, they thought they'd grown it, but they didn't.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, I know people are concerned about the high tides, but is there a correlation between the lower low tides and the warmer temperatures and some of those harmful algal blooms?
Well, so yes, I turn those slides off, but I have slides that you're getting more, with the warmer water, you're getting more HABs, and more significantly is they're more toxic, or they're toxin producing. Like This pseudonychia, the plankton that causes domoic acid, doesn't always produce toxin, but in a warmer ocean, it produces toxins more. So we have pseudonychia in Puget Sound. If you go out and do plankton sampling out here, we have pseudonychia, but we very rarely have a domoic acid problem. We're on the coast, they have lots of domoic acid.
Another thing though was like 2 years ago when we had the big heat wave, we had also some really low tides, and a lot of the native shellfish got hit pretty hard
Yeah.
from just because they got baked out of those.
Well, that was the heat dome,
Yeah.
which overlapped one of our 18.6 year mother of all low tides. We had a 3.5 foot minus out here in Sandwich Bay and stuff. Not just Sandwich, but all around, it cooked shellfish.
On our beaches, we had dead clams all over the place.
Thankfully, here in Sandwich, I was out on my farm during that heat dome, and it's probably one of the most pleasant places to be, because there was a north wind. It was like the air conditioner just pumping cool air at us. And so the only thing I saw die out here were cockles. Cockles were the only, and that was true all around Puget Sound. Cockles got hit the hardest. I think they're shallow, a lot of them are right on the surface, and they just didn't do the seagulls were having a feast out there. But then Taylor's lost a bunch of clam seed. They just timed their plants and lost a bunch of clam seed. But yeah, we're really pretty fortunate.
What about winter low tides and freezing events?
That's almost a bigger deal for us. We have those big 3 foot minuses in December as well, and of course with this 18.6 year cycle, those lows are lower, and so if we overlap a freezing event, we did that in 2019 out here. We had a Fraser blow on a low tide series. Ben Cove and Taylor's lost a third of their clams. I was fortunate enough, tucked far enough over, chucking that mountain kind of protected me. And I also had a thick carpet of seaweed on my natural insulation. I was cussing it next spring, but it saved my clams. Sorry, another hand, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. How long does it take the tide to fill the bay? Now granted, when it's a low,
Yeah,
it's gonna take longer than a high low,
So,
if you will.
so maybe to frame it the amount of time we have to work, because that's what we look at. So, for me on my farm, on a good low tide, I'll get about a 3.5 hour window to work from when my farm goes dry to when I'm chased off by the tide. Our son who works for Taylor's on a lot of their higher grounds, he'll be out there for 5 hours. He'll have 5 hours of working time instead of my 3.
So
Just
follow up
depends
to
on where
that.
you're at.
On a low, the beaches the sand is getting warmer from the sun, and that's what's killing.
Well, that's what
clams.
happened. Stuff was just exposed in that hot sun. It just got cooked.
Yeah.
On that heat dome. So another problem related to your question that we face is not red tide, but it's also an issue for us when we have warmer weather and not even necessarily the low tides, is a naturally occurring marine bacteria called Vibrio perihemolyticus, and it causes gastroenteritis. So if we get it in our shellfish, and that oyster is like a little incubator at low tide. So if any of you are growing shellfish out here on your own beaches, pay attention to this, because that oyster, when tide goes out, it's full of liquor, and it sits there baking in the sun. That dark shell and gets really hot, and it's just a perfect incubator for that Vibrio bacteria. So you don't want to harvest at low tide. You might want to go gather them and put them in a bag and put them on your beach and let the tide come back in, because they open up and start pumping and they dump that bacteria right away. Our regulations require the oysters be resubmerged a minimum of 4 hours before we can harvest them. Deal with that Vibrio.
That's good to
Taylor's,
know.
because of the volume of half-shell oysters we produce, millions and millions of them, we've invested in a huge recirculating refrigerated seawater system at our processing plant in Shelton. So all of those oysters that are going for raw consumption come into that facility and sit there at 52 degrees, which through research we've learned is the ideal temperature to keep the oyster actively pumping, but the Vibrio bacteria won't grow, and they'll dump that Vibrio bacteria in that system. It's a UV sterilized recirculating system. and we've got the ability to test Vibrio. We've got this unique kit, we just started using it last year, developed by a Korean scientist, that allows us to really economically test Vibrio levels in the oysters, which we ran 1,100 samples last summer of Vibrio, which is more testing than anyone's ever done for Vibrio. It's really a cool kit, it's really nice. We're working with the FDA to see if we can get it validated to be used officially by the National Shellfish Program, because it's just so informative to understand what those Vibrio levels are. Otherwise, it's gotta go to a state lab that uses PCR methods. It's super expensive and time consuming and resource intensive. So anyhow, that's another issue. Vibrio, a challenging one for us.